Welcome to the Unfettered Speech Podcast. I'm Patrick Sullivan.
And I'm Leonard Goodman.
Leonard, good to see you as always.
Nice to
You've
see
got a
you,
great
Pat.
guest as always. So
Yeah.
why don't you just kick it off?
Okay, I will. Today we're welcoming Ben Freeman. He's the director of Democratizing Foreign Policy program at the Quincy Institute. He investigates money in politics, defense spending, and foreign influence in America. And he is also the co-author with William Hartung of the recently released book called The $1 Trillion War Machine, which I'd like to start with talking about the $1 Trillion War Machine. Of course, the book's already out of date because Trump has announced a $1.5 trillion that we're going to spend on our. Well, it's not even. They don't even pretend it's defense anymore. It's now the War Department. So let me ask you, what do we get for all that money, and how does it compare to other nations, including our adversaries, and what they spend?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me say first, thank you both so much for having me here. It's great to be with you. And thanks for calling out how outdated my 2-month-old book is already, where the folks are clamoring for a second edition already. It's unfortunate. When we put this book together, we had this title set 2 years ago. And so we thought this title of $1 Trillion War Machine was going to be prophetic. And it went from being prophetic to being descriptive to very quickly now being outdated. So it's been a wild journey. But to your question there, Leonard, this plus up that they're talking about, would be about 50% of the Pentagon's budget. And it would amount to, in real dollars, about a $500 billion increase in Pentagon spending. Let's put that in perspective real quick. That would be more than almost every country in the world combined spends on their militaries. And that's just a plus up. We've already got the $1 trillion to start with. And so, you're talking about more than China, more than Russia, more than Iran, any other, boogeyman you can think of that might be an enemy of the U.S. All of their militaries combined don't spend $500 billion on their military. So this would be an unprecedented, historic plus up in military spending.
For a little perspective, could you tell us what does China spend? What does Russia spend? Just to give us a little perspective on it.
China's a little hard because they're a little cagey with their figures, but based on our best estimates, we're looking at somewhere in the $250 to $300 billion range for China. For Russia, significantly less. Than they're not even touching $100 billion in military spending these days. And then a huge drop off there from other countries like Iran. They're spending a couple of tens of billions of dollars a year. Similar situation with North Korea too. Venezuela, next to nothing on its military. So you add up all of these quote unquote adversaries of the U.S. and it's just not even comparable to what the U.S. spends on its military.
And then how do you spend $500 billion in a year? I mean, is that even possible? I mean, as you said, it's a massive increase, but even for this Pentagon, and I want to talk about procurement and how that works, or doesn't work, but is it even possible to spend $500 billion? Is it all to be spent in fiscal year 2026? Or is this to say, we're going to build this Star Wars type thing or this contraption or this AI thing, and it's going to take a couple of years, but this year we're going to allocate the money? Is that how it works? Because how can you spend? I mean, the whole budget was $800 billion 2 years ago, right? So now it's $500 million more in a year. So where is it? Where would it all go?
In a word, if I had to say in a word, how would they spend $500 billion more in a year? Poorly. It would be wasted. It would just be chock full of waste, fraud, and abuse. Every sort of nightmare scenario you have when you pay your taxes, and you're hoping the government is good stewards of it. The government will not be good stewards of a $500 billion year over year plus up. The question is how you pose a really good question there, Patrick, about how this would actually take shape. Would this be part of the regular appropriations process, which would mean that you would have to have a very quick spin out in the next fiscal year? More than likely, what they'll try to do is similar to what they did in 2025 with the big, beautiful bill. They'll try and pass this reconciliation package with this in it, maybe some other stuff that they want to kind of force down our throats. And if they do it similar to what they did there, that has a 5-year spend out period. Not to get too wonky with your listeners, but that has a 5-year obligation period and up to 10 years of an actual spend out period for that big, beautiful bill money. I can imagine they would try to do something like that for this. But you just don't know with the Trump administration. Trump hasn't put any of the details out. We already have the heads of the armed services committees, both Republican chairs of those committees, saying they're in favor of this 1-year $500 billion increase. So I don't know. It could be the nightmare scenario of spending just an absurd amount of money overnight and wasting most, if not all of it.
How much of our defense spending goes to our troops, their salaries, their health care, their supplies, and how much of it goes to private contractors
This
or
is
private contractors?
It's a wonderful question, Leonard. And I think this is one of the biggest myths of Pentagon spending. We're told support the military because you got to support the troops. The fact is that more than half of the Pentagon's budget does not go to the troops. More than half of the Pentagon's budget goes to private contractors. It goes to these special interests. It goes to the Lockheed Martins of the world, the Raytheons, the General Dynamics, RTX. It goes to these private companies, and they're turning around and using a lot of that money for things like stock buybacks, spending billions of dollars some years to buy back their own stock, which it's great for shareholders. It drives up the stock price. It does nothing for national security, though. So, when you're spending billions of taxpayer dollars to up share prices, you're not doing anything to keep any of us safer. And at the same time, a lot of the CEOs of these corporations are making 10, 20. We found a guy when we were doing research for the book who was making $80 million a year as the head of a defense contractor. So, when you talk about that kind of pay and you realize that more than half the Pentagon's budget is going to firms like that, you realize what the military budget really is these days. It's a cash cow. It's an ATM for a lot of these firms. And, that would really only be put on steroids if we added another $500 billion to their budget.
So I wanted to ask you about procurement, because I've read about what happens to some of these projects that they'll start. And one of the things they'll do is keep piling features and features on top of other features until the whole thing, whatever it is completely unworkable, can't be manufactured, or if it is manufactured, can't be run. And they spend a lot of money that way, and then it all collapses in on itself. And I'm thinking of like the littoral combat ship as an example, even the F-22, I think.
The F-35.
The F-35, a lot of these fighter planes, they want them to take off vertically and horizontally and land on carriers and, do these. So they keep piling on requirements until it's unfeasible. And I suppose then the money that's spent is spent on consultants. Is that right? So when you say, we spent a couple $100 billion on littoral combat ships that don't work, they don't barely float. So where does all that money go? Consultants and engineering firms and that sort of thing?
Yeah, a lot of it goes there, and a lot of it too goes over. I'm so glad you brought up the littoral combat ship. In a previous life, I worked at the Project on Government Oversight. And I worked directly with whistleblowers who were calling out this ship from day one. This was back in 2011 when they were sort of trying to figure out if this was a feasible ship or not. And I was talking to folks who were intimately involved with the program, and they were just telling me over and over again how flawed the ship was from the very design of it. The ship's breaking down when it's out at sea. You can't maneuver the thing. It's got cracks and corrosion and just hit the water. The thing was a floating boondoggle. Yet we kept going. So a lot of the money is going to the contractors. A lot of the money is going to some of those shareholders things, to things like buybacks that I mentioned. But a huge chunk of the money here too is going to these companies' lobbyists. And so, when you got a company like Lockheed Martin, who was one of the main builders of the littoral combat ship, Lockheed Martin at any time has dozens of lobbyists working for them. The last time I looked up Lockheed Martin, they had over 50 lobbyists on their payroll. The Quincy Institute, where I call my work home, we don't have 50 total employees, let alone 50 lobbyists. But when you have that kind of lobbying power and that clout, and we interviewed some of the lobbyists for Lockheed Martin and some of these other firms when we were working on this, we interviewed some folks who were working on, some lobbyists who were working on the littoral combat ship, and they were very clear about what they did when all of this news came out from these whistleblowers about the cracks and the corrosion on the littoral combat ship. They took the fight to Congress. They took the fight behind the scenes there, and they said, "We're not gonna disagree that the ship's got its problems, but what we are going to tell you is that ship provides jobs in your district." And they went around to every single congressional district where they could find even one or two jobs in, and went to that office and said, "You vote against this ship, we're going to let all your constituents know that you're cutting jobs in your district." And so they made this sort of, Faustian bargain with them to keep that what sailors actually call the little crappy ship. They did all that to keep the little crappy ship afloat.
So I'm still trying to follow the money on it, something like that. Can you help me with, because you've done a lot of work with lobbyists, foreign lobbyists, et cetera. So if you're one of these 50 how does the money get? We all know, kind of, there's sort of a vague notion that we have that lobbyists influence legislators and legislators vote for this stuff and then somehow they get money back. But could you make it a little more clear for us, like how it actually works? So if I'm a lobbyist, I'm going to go to a senator or a congressperson. I'm going to say, I want you to do this for, as you said, maybe jobs in your community or whatever. So then is there a campaign donation that's made to a political action committee just to sweeten the pot? Is that where the money would go then? And the lobbyist is sort of an agent delivering this money, so it's coming from, say, the contractor through the lobbyist who's a conduit to a PAC? Is that how it works?
Yeah, that's part of it. I think it's useful to think about like the work of a lobbyist in terms of, they have a toolkit. They have kind of an influence toolkit that they can use. And, sometimes they need a hammer. Sometimes they need a screwdriver. It might be a different thing depending on which office they're going to. But, I think there's a few big buckets here. And you've hit on one of them here, campaign contributions. And this is this is what everybody thinks of when they think of the lobbyist interactions with Congress, that, it's sort of like, if it was a cartoon, they'd be walking in with the bag of cash, putting it on the table and say, vote this way. While that makes for a good story, that's not really often how the lobbying and influence industry works. Well, money is certainly important. Money can definitely get you in the door. And particularly what we see in the lobbying industry now is we have what are called bundlers. So there's caps on, campaign finance limits. So you can only donate a little over $2,000 as an individual lobbyist to any individual campaign. That's not enough to move the needle in most congressional elections. So you're not going to get a lot of attention for just a $2,000 donation. But what you'll do is you'll start to bundle contributions to an individual member. So you'll write a $2,000 check. You'll get, say 50 people at your firm to write $2,000 checks. Suddenly you're talking $100,000. Then you might host a dinner, invite a lot of your other wealthy friends to that dinner. And so suddenly that $100,000 becomes $1 million or becomes $2 million. And then if you're the one at the center of all that bundling, you start to exert a lot more power, and you can influence that person a lot more. But that's only one tool that the lobbyists are using these days. Another big one is the jobs issue, which I had already mentioned. And this is really a key to get members' attention, because basically what the lobbyists are doing here, they're bringing it home. They're bringing this big kind of national shipbuilding program home to individual members. So they don't want you thinking about the national security implications of this. For most lobbyists, and that's what your listeners should know about this, lobbyists, more often than not, they're not talking about what's good for America when they're talking about these programs. They're talking about what's good for you, Congressman. They're talking about what can benefit you specifically, what can help you get reelected, what can help the economy in your district. So that's why they'll lead in with the jobs argument. So that's why they'll comb through things like the defense bill every year. They'll comb through and find anything that might touch on specific districts. And that's what they go in for. That information is really their currency and what makes them powerful.
Ben, could you talk a little bit about the use of private for-profit contractors? Now, my understanding is that is fairly a recent phenomenon. I don't know, the last few decades. Because if you read about World War II, it seems like the U.S. government sort of took over plants and said, "This is what we're producing tanks here." So it wasn't just contracting it out to these for-profit entities. It was actually the government taking them over. So now we have these companies like Lockheed Martin that I think all of their income comes from U.S. or U.S. taxpayers or foreign sales. I don't think they have a whole lot of products that they're selling to civilians. Can you explain why do we use why do we use private contractors instead of just in-house? For example, even like the Army now, they used to police their own area or do their own laundry, but now it's all contracted out to these private firms. Why is that? Why?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that started kind of creeping up through the mid 20th century. Really, you're exactly right about World War II. It was the opposite during World War II, and World War I to a certain extent as well, where we said we're at war. We had a great industrial capacity in the U.S. The military needed that. They said, we're going to take that and we're going to start building things that the military needs. So, very much went the other way. So we're taking that commercial asset. After World War II, you start to see this kind of trickle away, bit by bit, but slowly. You still had shows I'm going to date myself a little bit, but a show like MASH, where most of the folks on the show, are enlisted folks. They're service members. They're cooking. They're cleaning. They're doing all this stuff that we sort of have this image of service members doing. But now, as you said, Leonard, so much of the work you couldn't film MASH anymore. If you had to film MASH today, most of the characters would be private contractors. And so that's how far it's gone. And really, the switch we identify in the book and elsewhere is that you really see the contracting industry just go gangbusters after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And part of the reason for that is going into 9/11, we were at a period of military drawdown, throughout the 90s and so-called peace dividend after the Cold War. We were in a spot. The world was, a lot more peaceful than it had been for decades. And so the military shrunk a little bit. 9/11 happens. Go into Afghanistan. We make the terrible decision to go into Iraq. We don't have enough personnel to do all of these things that we wanted to do. And so contractors are then initially seen as something of a Band-Aid. Like, okay, we don't have the resources and the capabilities to do everything we want to do. Let's hire some external contractors to come in and fill that void for us. The problem is, as we now know, looking back in hindsight, is that it wasn't a Band-Aid. Contractors became a very permanent part of the military industrial complex after that. And, folks we interviewed for the book tell us stories about working side by side with a contractor for years on end. So, many of these positions, they're not temporary, they are permanent. And yet we're paying contractors 2, 3, sometimes 4 times what we're paying service members to do the exact same tasks.
Yeah, I've heard stories of cafeterias in Iraq, for instance, where you get the contractor gets a per head payment. Anyone who goes through the turnstile, so it doesn't matter what your fee. You've got nice food there, but it's not K rations or something. But you just get paid a clip every time someone walks through, and it becomes it becomes a form of graft or corruption, isn't it? At some point where it's just like we're not even really feeding these troops. We're running a turnstile, that prints money. So there, it's become disconnected. But again, why do politicians support that? Is it because they're getting paid by those contract? Do the contractors make political donations then back to the Congress people? Why as a Congressperson would I support, you know, Halliburton or whomever getting into the catering business for the military?
I think a couple things were going on there, and you're exactly right about all the issues in Afghanistan. And we know a lot again in hindsight about what went wrong in Afghanistan from the Cigar Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. Just I encourage your listeners, your viewers, to go back and look at some of these reports. These are just horror stories about waste, fraud, and abuse that was happening in these conflict zones. And part of the direct answer to your question is that members of Congress were supporting those contractors because at least initially they didn't have good other options, and there were not a lot of good other options. And then two, they didn't know just how bad it was until we got Cigar in there, until we got some of these reports coming out. And so it was, hindsight's 2020. And so, they were kind of taking the contractors at their word early on that they were providing good services. But we of course learned they weren't after the fact. But then we sort of kind of create our own. An old colleague, Winslow Wheeler, who used to call it the self-licking ice cream cone, where you say once they get in there, they create the problem that we're not getting good food to our soldiers. But okay, well who can fix it? Well, us. And it's like, well, aren't you the ones who aren't giving our soldiers good food? Like, yeah. But we're the only ones who can do it. And so you got to keep going on this train here. So fast forward 20 years, and that's why we end up spending over $5 trillion in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, with enormous sums of it just being flat out wasted.
Ben, before we move on, because I do want to talk about your other area of expertise, which is think tanks. But before I do, I want to ask you to sort of come back to the beginning. What we're getting for our $1 trillion, because I know here in Chicago, people do not feel a whole lot of security. People are afraid to let their, a lot of schools have been closed and they have to go to different neighborhoods. Sometimes there's gang problems. People don't feel really safe, even sending their kids to school. So what are we getting for $1 trillion? And I want you to see have you ever thought about what a true defense budget would look like if we were just going to put a military together that could defend our borders from attack? What would that look like? And would it cost $1 trillion?
No, absolutely not. It's a great question. I think if you talk about a true Department of Defense, President Trump has moved away from that. Now it's the Department of War, which I actually think is a more accurate description of what the Pentagon does. It is the War Department. It's not an organization that's too worried about defense. We've sort of got that on lockdown. So if you wanted a true Department of Defense that was really just concerned with protecting the homeland, I think you could very easily cut the Pentagon budget in half. Forget a $500 billion plus up. You're talking about a $500 billion cut. I think it's not unreasonable at all to say, we have two giant oceans around us, in friendly neighbors and with Canada and Mexico. We don't have any imminent threats to us. And so the idea that we can't defend ourselves for $500 billion is just lunacy to me. And again, to loop it back to my opening comments, our perceived greatest adversary in the world, China, is spending around $250 to $300 billion a year on their military. So even at my $500 billion level, we're still going to be outspending China by about $200 billion a year. So it's insanity to me to believe that's not enough to defend the homeland here. To the other part of your question, Leonard, I think that is such a good question to ask. And the real question is at the heart of this book is what is security? and if you ask the average American citizen, they talk about the things that you mentioned. How's our education system? How's our healthcare? Can I afford groceries? Rents are skyrocketing these days. Can I afford housing? Those are the things Americans associate with security. And so, if you were to take some of that $500 billion cut where, fake President Freeman just made to the Pentagon budget, if we were to take some of that and to provide for those real things that Americans are really worried about, I think you'd see an American public that felt a lot more secure in the American homeland.
Let's, if it's okay with Pat, let's move on to think tanks. I know for a lot of us, our experience with think tanks, I think people don't really know a whole lot about think tanks. I think our experience is we might read an op-ed that comes from someone from the Brookings Institute or one of these Foundation for the Defense of Democracies or one of these groups. Or we might see experts on mainstream television that are sent by think tanks. So what should we know about these think tanks, and how influential are they?
That is a great lead into this question. And to your point, that is exactly how most people interact with think tank experts. They don't even know they're hearing from somebody from a think tank. They may not understand what that term means, but they're watching the news. They're listening to the radio. They're checking out a podcast like this, and they hear that an expert comes on. We've got an expert from so and so place. They may have no clue. Even Brookings is a recognizable name, but for a lot of people, they may not even know what Brookings is. It's the most prestigious think tank in the world. You sort of go down the list from there, and the average listener may have no clue what this place is, where this person is coming from. But what that listener doesn't realize is that this person is hailing from an organization that very, very likely takes money from foreign governments and takes money from defense contractors. If they're saying anything about U.S. foreign policy and you're hearing them, listening to them, or reading something they wrote in a mainstream media outlet, and they're talking about foreign policy, chances are they have received some money from a foreign government, and from Pentagon contractors, and also very likely the U.S. government itself. And I know all this because we at the Quincy Institute, my wonderful colleague Nick Cleveland Stout and I, we've put together what's called the Think Tank Funding Tracker, and your viewers can check it out at thinktankfundingtracker.org. We went and took a hard look at the top 50 think tanks in the U.S. and we did a deep dive on their funding, and we wanted to see exactly how much money they were getting from the U.S. government, foreign governments, and Pentagon contractors. And what we found was that most of the top think tanks, who have these experts that you see all over the media, most of them are awash in foreign money and money from defense contractors.
How much money are we talking about? And what do they have to disclose all this money? Is it considered? So if I'm at a Raytheon or Lockheed Martin and I want to give money to a think tank, is it tax deductible? Can I write it off as a charitable donation, even though they're basically doing lobbying, PR work for my firm?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the Think Tank Funding Tracker available here. You're exactly right, Leonard. It is a tax deductible contribution. So most think tanks are 501c3 nonprofits, which does mean that contributions are tax deductible. So there's some exceptions to this. Some think tanks have kind of political action committees, C4s, where the contributions to those aren't tax deductible. Some are more like corporations, but the vast majority are nonprofit organizations, and so you can make a quote unquote charitable contribution to them. But to your point, we know, and through my research, Nick's research, my excellent colleague Eli Clifton has done phenomenal work on think tanks, and what we have found across the board is there's no such thing as a free lunch when it comes to think tank funding. So that money is coming in, and the donors expect to get something in return. And what that something is varies markedly from think tank to think tank, and from donor to donor too, frankly. But we found examples over and over and over again where, exactly to your point, Leonard, think tanks doing work that looks a lot like what lobbyists do. They're reaching out to members of Congress. They're helping congressional offices write speeches, even write legislation with them. So think tanks are doing things that lobbyists, public relations firms do, but without any of the disclosure or the transparency behind it. So in a way, this is kind of this like secret of DC, that if you really want to get something done in Washington and you want to do it quietly, just make a gigantic donation to a think tank and they will quietly get done whatever you want to get done.
And for these think tanks, isn't it kind of a home for retired politicians and maybe military people as well? That once you retire, if you've done a good job for so and so, like, hey, they've contributed to the think tank X, and you'll get a nice sinecure there for all your services. Is that a true statement?
That is absolutely spot on, and we maybe non-affectionately called them holding tanks sometimes, because when somebody leaves you're in an administration and your party loses power, you suddenly find yourself without a job. Well, just wait just a second. A think tank is right down the street, waiting to support you, waiting to bring you into a cushy job. And then hopefully in 4 years or 8 years, when your party is back in favor, you go right back into the administration. You just kind of bide your time, hold out in that think tank life for a little bit. And Patrick, I have a wonderful example for you from the world of the littoral combat ship to bring it full circle with our previous conversation. There was a guy, the undersecretary of the Navy, who was something of my arch nemesis when I was doing the work with the littoral combat ship whistleblowers. And he and I are on a public forum at the Cato Institute debating the merits of the littoral combat ship. And he was vehement, literally banging on the podium saying, this is a combat ship. He was just rah, rah, rah about it. And fast forward, he leaves his Navy service, never backs down from the utility of the littoral combat ship. He goes to work for an organization called the Center for a New American Security, CNAS, which was a left-leaning sort of pro-tech think tank. He gets a nice, cushy senior vice president position there for a few years. And then the Biden administration comes back into power in 2001. He finds his way right back in to the Biden government once again. So it's a perfect example of somebody who's kind of at the heart of this military-industrial complex, going to a think tank, holds out for a few years just to go right back in to another Democratic administration.
Ben, I was looking at some of your articles, and you wrote a bit about the Ukraine war, and I'm looking at one, weapons industry funded think tanks behind the case for endless war in Ukraine. That's one of your pieces from June of 2023. And one of the things you point out in these is, I want to talk a little bit about the scholarship that you see in these think tanks. So all these pro-war defense industry funded think tanks make the case for, we must continue to support Ukraine with more and more resources. We shouldn't get squirrely on it. Russia must be defeated. Absolutely. They need to be given a bloody nose and a black eye and all those other metaphors. Do not worry about nuclear weapons. Putin won't use them. This conflict is not existential to Russia. Now is not the time for negotiations. We must continue to fight. We cannot have a deal between the United States and Russia while Putin is in there. These are all points that will be familiar to Americans that all come out of these think tanks that are defended by the war industry. I mean, it's so shocking and disgusting to think that these companies are making tax deductible contributions to get this type of academic scholarship to pay for this, so that we can all be propagandized and to think that we shouldn't worry about nuclear war with Russia. It'll be fine. It's not an existential threat. Can you comment on some of basically the quality of the scholarship? Because basically, you're an academic.
Yeah.
You think about these issues. Is this good scholarship? I mean, let me put it another way. If this was a fair playing field or marketplace of ideas, would these ideas win out in any fair debate, or do they win out because they have all the money behind them and it's so profitable to continue this war? So that's why we get these dumb articles about how we shouldn't worry about nuclear war. It's just, it's not going to happen.
Right.
What do you think about this scholarship?
I mean, you said it right there, probably better than I could. I mean, this is a really important thing. I think folks need to know about DC. DC is not a meritocracy. DC is a town that is built around selling out to the highest bidder. And that happens in a couple ways. The scholarship that we see from think tanks, a lot of these defense industry funded think tanks, foreign government funded think tanks, it is incredibly shoddy when it comes to issues that relate to their funders. And if it's not shoddy, it is at the very least selective. And what we found, part of this process, and you talk to think tanks, there's been good academic research on this too, that lets us know that a big part of what you're buying when you're a defense contractor making a big contribution to a think tank is you're buying silence. You're buying the ability to put a big muzzle on some of the most influential experts in the world. Because let me tell you, if you work at a think tank and you say a lot of bad things about one of your think tank's biggest funders, you're either A, not going to work at that think tank for much longer, or B, that funder is going to stop funding your think tank. In either case, there is a very, very strong motivation for you to censor any critique you might have about that Pentagon contractor. So this is the reason why we don't get really honest debates about the wars that we're having. And I wrote that piece about the Ukraine war, and that was the perfect example. We're hearing stories from the battlefield in Ukraine about how Russians are using, kind of off the shelf kamikaze drones to take out tanks, to take out serious artillery over there. And yet, what do you hear think tanks in DC clamoring for? Oh, we got to get them more tanks, more tanks so they can get blown up. Well, and we do, we end up sending them more tanks. The real sad part, the tragedy of it is we foist these tanks on the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian soldiers get in them, and surprising no one, the Russians kamikaze drone them, and then Ukrainian soldiers die because of it. So, whether these think tankers realize it or not, there's real world consequences to what they're doing. People's lives are literally on the line when you're saying that the U.S. should send military equipment to a country, or you're saying, to your example, Leonard, if you're saying the U.S. should not at all care about nuclear war, the costs for that, of course, are literally existential. And yet you see the same thing going on there with think tanks that take funding from the nuclear weapons industry.
So let's sometimes people ask us, well, why do you spend so much time on military issues? Your unfettered speech really about free speech. And so what I'm seeing here is a pattern, which is, you talked about self-licking ice cream cones. This defense budget is a self-licking ice cream cone, because you're taking all this money. The money flakes off to lobbyists. The lobbyists get it to Congress people. It goes to their, whatever. Some of it goes to their districts, but most of it goes into the hands of contractors of various kinds, private people. And then you have the think tanks that create a narrative about, say 200 billion to Ukraine. The question is it enough, right? It's not the question, should we do it at all? The question is, should it be 200 or more, right? And so let's have a debate about that. So they sort of frame the terms of discourse, and then you have the media, right? And the media does the same thing. So there's a sort of notorious clip that went around recently of CNN, grilling Marco Rubio about, why did you just kidnap Maduro? Why didn't you kidnap, his entire cabinet? What's the matter with you just kidnapping one president? You should, explain yourself. So that's the terms of the debate. And, I'm sure they would have a think tanker on saying like, well, indeed, this could have been a much bigger, whatever they want to say about it. But it frames the terms of the debate in a way where sane voices are just considered outside of the norm. And so it's all part of the same, right? Do you talk about the media, and how the media, can you talk about the media and how it relates to all of the spending and the other things that we've covered tonight?
Happily, yeah, and Patrick, I could not agree more with that sentiment. To the title of your podcast, we are not having unfettered speech when we're talking about national security public debates. It's a one-sided debate. The Pentagon contract, as we talk about in the think tank funding tracker, there's tens of millions of dollars every year from Pentagon contractors going to think tanks, but that's just a drop in the bucket compared to their influence on the media. Mainstream media outlets are running ads for defense contractors. They take out full page ads in places like the New York Times. You see Super Bowl commercials with the new stealth bomber coming on. That's $2 million a pop right there. And on and on. There's a regular mundane, day-to-day advertising too. The DC Metro also, it's important to mention, is just awash in Pentagon contractor ads. So, even your public transportation system is just covered in military contractor propaganda. So the purpose of all of that is to make sure we're not having an honest debate when it comes to national security strategy. It's to make sure that all the voices for war drowned out voices like ours, voices like mine, voices that we have at the Quincy Institute. If there was an even debate, we'd win. I feel very good about it. We got some very smart folks at the Quincy Institute, and the facts are on our side. But that's not the case. A huge megaphone is provided to any hawkish person in DC, and they have to do it. I think we lay this out in the book, I think, well, but the self-licking ice cream cone part of this, a huge part of it is about controlling the debate to ensure that there is always a cause for $1 trillion military budget, that there's always a seeming monster abroad that is just about to invade us, or that's going to affect our freedom, or that is in some way an evil adversary that we've got to take out. And the reason they have to always have an enemy, they always have to have a boogeyman, is because if they don't, and we're spending $1 trillion or $1.5 trillion potentially on the military, and the average American looks outside and sees a really peaceful world, they start asking uncomfortable questions about, why are we spending that much? Where else could that money go to help me? Those are the questions contractors don't want to ask. So they make sure that the information environment is controlled by war hawks and people who want to send our service members to war.
Ben, just to sort of follow up on the point Pat made, and you've also mentioned that it's not just these dumb voices that we hear. I guess the reason why they don't sound so dumb to talk about, well, we have to send more and more weapons to Ukraine, everything's going to be fine. They don't sound so dumb is because we don't hear from the other side, like you're saying. And I think that's one of the important things. I know in this show, we try to bring on other voices, and there's other shows that are way bigger than ours, like Judge Napolitano, he's been on our show. And that's where you can go and hear people like Jeffrey Sachs or John Mearsheimer or real experts or people from the Quincy Institute, who could actually educate us about what's going on. And they were telling us from the very beginning of the war, this is what's going to happen. They were proven right. But, it doesn't matter because people aren't hearing that unless they go to independent media. And fortunately, more and more people are. Let me ask you, I have a lot of close associates here in Chicago who are heavily invested in the defense industry, and some are board members or former board members of big five defense firms. And I get into these arguments with them all the time because, what they'll tell me is, we're just vendors, we don't make policy. And and then I ask them about the think tanks and the lobbyists, and they say, well, even the ones that are board members, they're like, well, I don't know how much we do with think tanks. It's not something that they really talk about in their board meetings, apparently. So, what would you say to people who are heavily invested and have to the point where they have enough money in to have board seats and all of that in a major defense contractor? Are they responsible at all for defense policy, for all these wars that we keep fighting, these endless wars? Or are they just vendors who, are keeping our country safe by supplying weapons?
Yeah, the vendor argument is one that I always have to chuckle at, because it's not just the board members who make this argument. Some of these CEOs will say it. Jamie Taslett, the head of Lockheed Martin. I heard him in an interview recently just saying, no, we don't make policy. This vendor argument. We're just supplying whatever the government tells us they need. We're here to provide it. And in the back of my head, I know that you have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on lobbyists at Lockheed Martin to push through programs like the Littoral Combat Ship in the F-35 program, which on a lot of metrics have been abject failures. And so, those weren't, it wasn't just the government, these companies aren't just hapless, just purveyors of whatever the government says. They're shaping policy. They spend a lot of money to shape government policy. There's just no two ways about it. And I think, certainly no offense to any of these folks, Leonard, if you do know them personally, but it just strikes me as disingenuous for a board member of one of these companies to not be aware of that, to not be aware that these companies are in the business of shaping U.S. government policy, in shaping the information environment too. That part of their revenues and expenses, it might be a lower line item, their think tank work, it might be lower on there than some of the other things they're doing, but there's just no two ways about it. They know this is going on. The CEOs of these companies go to these think tanks they're funding. They provide a platform for these folks. They help to connect them with policymakers too. They're part of the system. If the board members don't realize that, then it might behoove them to do a little more research into their own companies. But it's happening whether they're aware of it or not.
So Ben, where do we go from here? We always like to ask that question. How do we get out of this? Because again, if it is a vicious circle, self-licking ice cream cone, budgets lead to, corruption, leads to information capture, leads to media capture, leads to higher budgets, leads to the same thing over and over again. How do we, look, the budget's gone from 800 billion to almost double that in 3 years. With no particular need, as you say, we're safest, in terms of our geography, one of the safest countries on earth. And so how do we break the cycle? How do people who, are looking out their window, you say look out their window and see peace, but they also look out their window, as Leonard alluded to, and see failing schools. They see, broken infrastructure. They see people who are out of work and who are leading lives of despair. And yet they can't get the resources to fix that. How does it all change when there's such a great incentive to just keep going, pumping this war machine up?
That is the $1 trillion question, or maybe the $1.5 trillion question now. So I love it. We come to this a little bit at the end of the book, and I think the solution was really right there in your question for us too, is that we have to get people to understand the scale of what's happening at the Department of War, the scale of this budget, and what we're not using that money for instead. And so part of the mission for the Quincy Institute, and for my team at the Quincy Institute specifically, when we talk about democratizing foreign policy, our goal is explicitly to bring greater transparency to this whole process, to ensure that when one of your listeners is listening to mainstream media and hearing from a think tank expert, we want your listeners to know that that expert is funded by an arms maker. We want people to have the resources that they need really quickly. That's why we created the think tank funding tracker, and that's why we have so many other resources at the Quincy Institute too, so people can know when they're hearing military propaganda, so they know how much is being spent on these lobbyists, think tanks, all these other levers of influence. We think transparency is a key to start. But then, the next thing, transparency is not enough in and of itself. We think that the next thing that needs to happen is people to understand these trade-offs and what's happening here. And that, an additional dollar going to the Department of Defense, it's not going somewhere else. It's not going to healthcare. It's not going to education. It's not going to, help control rent prices. It's not going to any of these other things that Americans might like. So we need to do more in explaining those trade-offs to folks and get folks to understand that when the government spends more and more and more on the military every year, it doesn't make us safer, because that money is coming away from the things that would actually make America safer at the end of the day.
Ben, if we have just a few minutes left, and we're going to let you go, but Pat and I were talking earlier about the Aspen Institute, which is one think tank. I know some folks that work there, and I actually visited there for one of their speaker programs. But they got in the news a few years ago because it turns out they called it like a tabletop exercise to prepare the press for something like the Biden laptop. This was before that was even known that there was a Biden laptop.
Mm-hmm.
But they prepared the press for basically how to respond to it and how to censor it, basically. Do you have any insight into that institute? I know they take a lot of money from the UAE, I think, but what can you tell us about the Aspen Institute, and how would they have foreknowledge of some huge news event that hadn't even happened yet and be preparing people for it?
Yeah, well, it had happened, right? It had the laptop was out there, known to the FBI that it existed, and they probably knew the story was going to blow. And that's about the time, I believe, that the Aspen Institute had this tabletop exercise. So it wasn't, they weren't prescient. They knew it was out there, right? Ben, are you familiar with that episode?
Yeah. That's my recollection of the TikTok there. But I will say, regardless of the timing, think tankers are insiders. They very often have access to knowledge and information that just is simply not available to the American public. And so it wouldn't surprise me to know if the Aspen Institute did get a scoop on that early. But this is why countries like the UAE love to fund think tanks. They know we know things that they don't already know. And so, it's just another part of the influence game too. It's another part of why think tank funding really matters.
Yeah. Well, look, Ben, we appreciate all the work you're doing at Quincy Institute. We're great fans of your organization, and fantastic book that is right on point for the things that we're struggling with right now as a country. So thank you for all your work, and we'd love to have you back on sometime to talk more about this, because these issues, I'd love to think that you're right, that when people get more transparency, more information, and understand the trade-offs of what they're giving away to buy all this stuff, that they'll be more aware of it. But I think we're going to have more conversations that are a little frustrating about how we're spending our resources as a society and a country. But thank you for all your work, and we'd love to have you back on to talk about it more.
Would love to be back on. It's been a pleasure, guys.
Thank you, Ben.
And don't forget to like and subscribe.